Welcome back, part of our continuing series. A lot of professors are busy. We're not able to get them to come down or spend time on an interview because they're doing research. And if they're good at research, they're very popular and it's hard to get a hold of them. So we are very appreciative when professors are able to spend a little bit of time to answer key questions. With us today is one of the most famous researchers related to this topic of political polarization. If you look into political polarization at the academic level, you'll see his name all over the place. His name is Morris P. Fiorina. He's a professor of political science at Stanford University, and he's the Went Family Professor and Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institute. He wrote an article called The Big Sort That Wasn't a Skeptical Reexamination. So Morris P. Fiorina is a big-time name in political science and specifically talking about political polarization. There was a concept that I've talked about routinely called the big sort. The big sort says that people are sorting themselves into ideological, like-minded communities since the early 1990s. That concept was published by a man named Bill Bishop. So this is his response to Bill Bishop's thing. And he's going, the big sort that wasn't a skeptical reexamination. Fiorina was known for saying, I'm not sure the American public is being sorted. Now, one person who debates with him a lot is Abramowitz. Alan A. Abramowitz is another major scholar in this field who completely disagrees with Fiorina and does believe America is being sorted. Another person is Liliana Mason, disagrees and also believes America is being sorted. So Fiorina has some colleagues who feel that he is incorrect and they disagree and think the big sort is happening. But he's one that caused a lot of attention questioning if the big sort was right. And he asked a lot of good questions and he did a lot of papers on that. And that's why we wanted to look into this. So what did he say? In 2008, journalist Bill Bishop achieved the kind of notice that authors dream about. His book, The Big Sort, Why Clustering of Like-Minded America is Tearing Us Apart, was mentioned regularly during the presidential campaign. Most notably, former President Bill Clinton urged audiences to read the book. Bishop's thesis is that Americans increasingly are choosing to live in neighborhoods populated with people just like themselves. In turn, these residential choices have produced a significant increase in geographic political polarization. Bishop does not contend that people consciously decide to live with fellow Democrats or Republicans. Rather, political segregation is a byproduct of the correlations between political views and the various demographic and lifestyle indicators people consider when making residential decisions. I agree with all that. Whatever the cause, Bishop contends that resulting geographic polarization is a troubling and dangerous development. I agree with all that. We do not doubt that various kinds of sorting are occurring in the United States, as they have in the past and no doubt will in the future. Most importantly, political science research has shown that during the last 3 decades, party sorting has occurred. Liberal-minded Americans have increasingly made the Democratic Party their home, and conservative-minded Americans have increasingly gravitated to the Republican Party. Questions about the amount of sorting and its causes, however, still remain. Pointing at Gelman and Lewandowski, those are 2 researchers. Yet claims about geographic sorting have always struck us as a somewhat questionable. Residential mobility notwithstanding, do the citizens of, say, Massachusetts or Mississippi differ more today than they did in the 1950s? Bishop and Cushing purport to establish the existence of geographic polarization by presenting changes in presidential returns by county, with particular emphasis on the difference between those close to 1976 and 2004 elections. By way of explanation, they write, we decided to use presidential election results instead of either voter registration or state elections as the common measurement among the nation's more than 3,100 counties to avoid the effects of different candidates or changing districts. On the contrary, a moment's reflection should show that far from minimizing the effects of different candidates, rely on presidential votes was biased. So what Morris Fiorina is saying, it does look like people are sorting themselves into ideologically like-minded communities. The problem is that Bill Bishop uses a particular data set to argue that polarization is happening. And he's looking at counties during the presidential election. And that data set isn't strong enough for him to make his point. That's mostly the problem that Fiorina has brought up, is that maybe people are sorting. Maybe they're sorting in ideological communities. Probably that's happening. But Bill Bishop points at specifically county level voting data for presidential elections going back to 1994 and says, here's the proof conclusively why. Not good enough to make that statement, is what Fiorina is saying. And as a scientist, he's supposed to do that. He's supposed to say, hey, does the data back up what we're saying? Or are we going, I feel this is right and this feels like a correct conclusion? You're not supposed to publish conclusions that feel right. You're only supposed to publish conclusions that you can prove. So I asked Fiorina, could I ask you one question? Do you think the big sort is real? I think that is described in the Bishop book, no. There are a number of studies that show that people of all the ideologies prize the same thing: good schools, safe streets, stable property values, etc. So the idea that people move to live with like-minded partisans has little empirical support. It is true, however, that because of party sorting in vast areas of the country, one party or the other is no longer competitive. So looking at regions of states or even entire states rather than neighborhoods, yes, there is geographic sorting. However, there's a number of studies that show that people of all ideologies prize the same thing: good schools, safe streets, and property values. What he's getting at there is there's a lot of polls that show Americans agree that although we're polarized and people don't like each other, when you say, hey, do you believe a woman should have the right to choose? It's like 56% say yes. Do you believe in reasonable gun control? 70-something% say yes. So they're looking at these polls and going, there's a clear majority of the country that agrees that this is the right direction. And so because of that, we can't say we're ideologically polarized. He's not the only one making this argument. There's many other people who are saying we have a lot of polls that show a majority of Americans agree on certain issues. Let me actually pull that up. This is what he's talking about. Let me show you. So this is an actual headline from CNN. Majority of Americans tend to agree with Democrats on everything, polling shows. And that came out April 7th, 2019. And I saw that title and I'm like, this can't be true. Just think about that. America agrees with the Democratic Party, polling shows. And they just went and printed it. There was no skepticism. There was nobody counter arguing the point. It was just, yeah, see? So there's a lot of people who go, we have these polls that show people want women to have the right to choose, and they want gun control regulation, and they want safer schools. So basically, most of America agrees with the Democratic points. They have a lot of polls showing that. That's true. One thing, though, is two things we've heard. Trump supporters don't do polls and throw the polls off. Hold on. Come on. Okay. Trump supporters don't do polls and throw the polls off. We've talked to some professors who said that there's some evidence that Trump supporters, the 78 million MAGA supporters, don't do polls because they don't trust them. And that's why none of the polling got that Donald Trump was going to win an election, because his members were taught to be distrustful of the system, the deep state, et cetera. And that meant that whenever somebody's asking them polling questions, they just don't participate. So you're actually getting polls without 78 million Americans in them because they don't want to participate in the polls, which would make the liberal side appear much larger. That's something we've heard from professors. The other thing is that even if a majority of humans agree on liberal issues, that does not mean a majority of states. So as we talked about with Norman Ornstein, even if you have 70% of the population say we want X, if you have 35 to 40 states who represent 30% of the population, they will get what they want and the majority of the population won't. That's how George W. Bush became president, even though he wasn't the popular election holder. That's how Donald Trump became president, even though he wasn't the popular election holder. States have rights, people don't. Norman Ornstein had pointed out we've already had 2 elections where a majority of the people said X and they didn't get that because the majority of the states said Y. So even if this is true and a majority of Americans agree with the Democratic side, it doesn't mean anything. Because if a majority of the states are conservative, even though they're a fraction of the population, they will control the Senate, the presidency, and the Supreme Court. So it won't matter. Secondly, there's some evidence that these polls are all off because you're missing Trump supporters. And that would explain how all the polling got it so massively wrong with Trump's election. The other thing I want to point out is this. I think Fiorina is making a case that there's polls showing that Americans are together, and there is the evidence showing the big sort based upon presidential elections may not be that strong or strong enough for Bishop to make his point. Perhaps. But here's something that's interesting. If I can find this. Sorry, bear with me. Here we go. There we go. How large is the divide between red and blue America? This came out in 2016. It was based upon this scientific study, or this study also came out after it, the geographic polarization of the American electorate, a country of increasing electoral landslides. So you have the New York Times and the scientific study both back this up. Now, Fiorina's study came out earlier. And this study goes from 92 all the way to 2016. Looking at presidential counties during a presidential election. And what it shows is that there has been geographical sorting from 1992 to 2016. Both this political scientific study and this New York Times study say that. And they came out in 2016. Now let's go back to Fiorina. And I was hoping to ask him this directly. It didn't work out. But let me go back to the Fiorina study. Give me 1 second. Sorry, give me a second. Okay, that's not working. Let's go back to Fiorina's study. Here we go. His study came out in 2012. So in 2012, Fiorina was saying, I don't know if the evidence that Bill Bishop has collected looking at counties in the presidential vote is strong enough to make the point he's making. He says that in 2012. The New York Times comes out in 2016 looking at additional data Fiorina didn't look at and say it's definitely true. And a scientific study comes out in 2018 looking at additional elections Fiorina didn't see and also said it's true. So Fiorina says Bill Bishop can't make those statements based upon counties with presidential election voting, perhaps. But the New York Times and another scientific study did the exact same thing, and they did it with even more data than what Fiorina was going to look at, and they totally both backed up Bill Bishop. So we'll leave it there. Thank you very much, everybody, and we'll see you soon.